Okay, hopefully you've got your paper in front of you and you need another coloured pen, such as a red pen, to make your corrections and notes on your paper itself. First thing you need to do is on the feedback page at the back where it tells you what mark you got, have a look at the grade boundaries here, and I want you to write down, if you were below MTG, write down how many marks off your MTG you were. If you are on target, then you could write down how many marks you were into that target, because it might be that you only just met your target, so you could still do with getting a few extra marks. Okay, so we'll start by going through section A, which is the psychopathology section, 24 marks. First question is to outline 2 definitions of abnormality apart from deviation from ideal mental health, and to refer to the above article in your answer. We've changed this from 3 to 2 definitions, so it's actually 4 marks for this question. 1 mark for each correct outline, plus 1 mark for linking each outline appropriately to the stem. Definitions must be outlined rather than just simply identified for credit. So you need to do more than just say, for example, statistical infrequency. For the first mark, the AO1 mark, you need to define it as well. So you get 1 mark for saying one definition is statistical infrequency, where behaviour that is uncommon is seen as abnormal. And then to get the second AO2 mark, you need to apply that to the scenario about hoarding disorder. So you need to pick out something from the scenario that suggests it is uncommon and that's why it's abnormal. So if you did this definition, hopefully you picked out this bit. Approximately 1 in 1,000 people have hoarding disorder. So that is clearly rare, and that is why that would be classed as abnormal to get the second mark. I'll go through with you what you could say for each of the appropriate definitions. So an alternative answer would be deviation from social norms, where behaviour that violates the rules of society is abnormal. That would get you 1 mark. And then for the AO2 mark, you need to say something like, because most of us are able to throw things away, that's why hoarding is seen as abnormal. Or the other option was to outline failure to function adequately, where behaviour that causes an inability to cope with everyday life is abnormal, 1 mark. Hoarding affects living or workspaces, and that's therefore why it affects everyday life and therefore is abnormal, so that's another mark. So you need to have done 2 of those. Just a last little comment about this question is that some students confused statistical infrequency and deviation from social norms. Try not to talk about in the deviation from social norms, try not to focus too much on things being rare or uncommon, because that just overlaps too much with statistical infrequency. So use the definition that we've got here, which is it violates the rules of society. Okay, question 2, suggest how the behavioural approach might be used to explain Kirsty's phobia of balloons. So here's the mark levels. To get level 2, 3 or 4 out of 4, you need to have relevant knowledge of the behavioural approach. It needs to be clear, mostly accurate, and applied to explain Kirsty's phobia of balloons. So I'm just going to go through some points that would all be credit worthy. See if you said any or all of these. Kirsty's phobia was initiated through classical conditioning. So you may or may not have actually used the term classical conditioning. If not, you can add that in. According to classical conditioning, balloons would be neutral stimuli at first, but after she experienced one bursting near her face, she will then have associated balloons with loud noises. Loud noises are unconditioned stimuli because they produce an unconditioned response of fear. So balloons then became a conditioned stimulus as they produce a conditioned response of fear in Kirsty. Well done if you also pointed out that this would be one trial learning, because it only mentions that she had that event occur once. So that's a good extra point to make. Her conditioned response of fear has also generalised to similar sounds like banging and popping. Well done if you pointed that out. And you could also mention that her fear is being maintained through operant conditioning, because she now avoids situations like parties or weddings because there might be balloons there, and her avoidance is being negatively reinforced because it's helping to remove anxiety. Just a point, you don't need to say all of that for 4 marks, but if you didn't get 4 marks on this question, then just add 1 or however many points you feel you need from this list to your answer. And then we'll go on to the next question. Question 3, distinguish between obsessions and compulsions. So this is quite a difficult question because it's not just requiring knowledge of what they are, but you have to actually differentiate between them. 1 mark out of the 2 will be given for a muddled or vague answer in which you've just suggested a distinction but it's maybe unclear or incomplete. Or 1 mark if you've just defined each component, i.e. if you said obsessions are the thoughts, compulsions are the behaviours. That would be a definition of each. You're not really distinguishing between them, so you wouldn't get the full 2 marks for doing that. To get the full 2 marks, you need to give a clear and coherent answer that emphasises the internal versus external distinction between the 2. So obsessions are internal because they are thoughts, compulsions are external because they are behaviours. Now, on this occasion, you might have been given full credit if you use the terms cognitive for obsessions and behavioural for compulsions, but in future I would use the words internal and external as well, so make sure you've added those into your answer. Question 4, explain how this study could be modified by checking the sleep questionnaire for test-retest reliability. Now, the important things to note in the question are it's asking you how would you check the reliability of the sleep questionnaire, not how could you improve it. So if you didn't get any marks, if you've been told that your answer was irrelevant, it could be because you focused on ways to improve reliability rather than check whether the study is reliable. And despite a lot of people getting this question wrong or not getting very many marks on it, it does actually tell you in the question what you should be talking about. Test, retest. The answer is there. You give them the questionnaire and then you give them it again. That's what you need to be talking about. So let's go through what you need to say for the 4 marks here. So 1 mark for each of these points. The same participants would complete the sleep questionnaire on more than 1 occasion. Not, as some people said, give it to different participants. That's not going to let you know whether the questionnaire is reliable. You have to give it to the same participants. If it's different participants, then obviously their scores are going to be different with the second group. So it's got to be the same group of participants who take the sleep questionnaire 2 times. And then each participant's scores from the first occasion should be correlated with the results on the later occasion. And nobody said this, but this is something to add. You would first display that on a scatter graph, which would show you what kind of relationship there was, or if there was a relationship between the first and the second set of scores. Then the strength of the correlation could be assessed using, for example, a Spearman's test. Then the degree of reliability would be determined by comparing the correlation with the statistical table to determine the extent of that correlation. There should be a strong positive correlation if the questionnaire is reliable. So I've circled here all the important elements needed to get the full 4 marks. Question 5, outline cognitive behaviour therapy as a treatment for depression. Here are the mark levels. To get top level marks, 3 or 4 out of 4, your answer needs to be linked to the treatment of depression. If you've just given a generic description of CBT, you shouldn't have been given more than 2 marks because you can't get into level 2 unless your answer is applied to depression. If you just use the word depression, then you could have possibly got 3 marks, but to get 4 marks, I'm looking for something a little bit more engaged than that, like mentioning symptoms, for example. So did you state in your answer the following? The aim of CBT is to replace negative beliefs about the self, world or future with more rational and healthy beliefs. Rather than just saying replacing irrational beliefs with rational beliefs, the bit that's underlined here is more applied to depression because they're the symptoms. The patient is then helped to identify those negative beliefs, and that's called thought catching. They're then helped to dispute them, and you could give an example that relates to one of the 3 types of disputing: pragmatic, logical or empirical disputing. So you could say, for example, that the client is helped to understand that if they have thoughts like "I am worthless," so that's an application to depression if you actually mention a symptom, the thought "I am worthless" is having a negative effect on their mood and how they feel about themselves. So it's not helpful to have that belief. That would be an example of pragmatic disputing. They may be given homework assignments, and a good example that's applied to depression would be they might be asked for homework to collect positive compliments from friends and family. And the outcome should be that once the patient is thinking more positive beliefs, that this should elevate their mood. Question 6. Outline and discuss one biological explanation for OCD for 6 marks. The breakdown is 2 AO1 for outlining and 4 AO3 for discussion, evaluation. So therefore you shouldn't have written too much for outline. 2/3 of your answer needs to be evaluation, and that is always the rule for a question that involves both outline and evaluation. It's 1/3 outline, 2/3 evaluation. Here are the mark bands. So you are just being asked for one biological explanation, but given that it's only for 2 marks, the outline bit, you need to be quite specific. Pick one specific explanation rather than trying to cover all of the genetic factors we've talked about or all of the neurotransmitters we've talked about. Just pick one of those and write 2 specific sentences about it. For your evaluation to be classed as clear and coherent, one of the things that I've noticed on some students' answers is that their AO3 points don't always match up to what they've given for AO1. So for example, some people have described genetic explanations, and then in the AO3 they've talked about a practical application of that being that you could identify in brain scans whether someone has OCD or not. Those two don't match up. You should only be talking about brain scans if you've done the brain-based explanation. So if your AO3 points and your AO1 points don't go together, then your discussion is not classed as coherent, so you won't be able to get into level 3. Here are the possible AO1 points that you could have included. For genetic explanations, you could have included the low activity variant of the COMT gene or a mutation of the SERT gene. As I said, there's no need to do both of these. For abnormal neurochemistry, you could have talked about high levels of dopamine or low levels of serotonin. Or for abnormalities in brain structure, you could have talked about hyperactivity in the OFC or damage to the caudate nucleus. So you need to pick one of those 6 explanations for AO1. For AO3, the evaluation material that you could use includes use of evidence to support whichever explanation, and make sure you pick the evidence that supports the explanation you've chosen. Methodological issues with the evidence. If you're doing a point like that, make sure that you link that back to the explanation in your conclusion to the point, otherwise you won't get any credit for it. Practical applications, and as I was saying earlier, make sure that what you say the practical application is matches the specific chosen explanation. And whichever explanation you've done, you should be able to make the point that it's a reductionist because it overlooks likely behavioural explanations, and you could explain briefly what they are. So that's all the possible content. You should be including at least 2 of these AO3 points in this answer.